The Society for Culture and Environment extends a warm welcome. You are watching a session titled Environment at a Precipice from the Bhopal Literature and Art Festival, January 2020. We have with us Mr. Mahesh Rangarajan, a researcher, author, and historian with a special interest in environmental history. He is a professor of environmental studies and history at Ashoka University. He will be in conversation with Mr. Abhilash Khandekar, journalist and environmentalist, and Mrs. Madhu Verma, an environmental economist presently working as chief economist at World Resources Institute, India.
Just adding to it, you are connecting history with nature, and that's a wonderful combination. You have been a historian, did all your education studying history, and suddenly you got into your PhD program, which had basic concentration over forest policy of the country, and that's what brought you to this particular stream of course, environment and connecting with history. Like, we have a very sophisticated technique of doing modeling in systems, where we use the past data and try to predict the future. So, does it, have a similarity with kind of understanding history and predicting future? Or these two are standalone kind of processes, and we want to amalgamate and bring them together to be more holistic in our approaches, and much useful outcomes can come out of it.
I think it will require a very brave historian to predict the future. Yuval Noah Harari has written a couple of books, probably 0.1%. And I think one of the reasons that historians are storytellers. So I was involved with environmental activism from a somewhat young age, with protecting the bridge in Delhi in school days, with Sundarlalji and the Chipko Andolan in some ways, with Dunu Roy, who ran the Vidusha Karkhana in Shadow. And one of the things a lot of us who drifted into the social sciences, history in particular, is that it's a very good way to think about the past because it tells stories. Now, the way you tell the story has a lot of insight, even for people who may not know these disciplines. So I'm not sure one can predict the future, but it can certainly inform you better about the future. So one of the things which I think emerges here also is that when you talk about people remaking environments, they are not always negative. So Nagendra, for instance, this Harin Nagendra's work on Bangalore. Bangalore is founded in roughly 1520s, 30s. It's about 500 years old. One way to look at it is that Bangalore is remodeled and made. There are all these reservoirs and lake systems which are set up. And right now there's a big struggle to resuscitate them and protect them. But what is important is that Bangalore became a city which is not next to a major river. And the making of these lakes was accompanied by enormous efforts to green the city. So it became a more livable environment and an inhabited space. So all the past is not only about destruction. I think this is important. Sometimes environmental history, it's a very senior historian who ran into two of us once in a library many years ago. And he said, let's have coffee. I can't name him. And he said, you guys both look really cheerful. So he said, why should we be cheerful? So you're studying environmental history. Disappearance of species, cutting down of forests, denudation, deforestation. I thought you'd really be full of despair. And our argument was that the story is not only of despair, it's also of hope.
I think we're sitting in a city, city of Bhopal, which is an amazing history of environment. The lake that you could see, the most beautiful lake in the country, and we were such a wonderful spite from concrete jungle of other cities. People had a waterscape,
And it's a Ramsar site.
It's a Ramsar site, and it was built in the 11th century. Look at the foresight of the then ruler and connecting, human populations with nature, and so well built into our environment. And look at what happened, by the modern construct, where it was the foresight of the king definitely existed, but we had a kind of a mindset of the modern rulers who built Union Carbide in the city. And what happened after that? So this is kind of connect. I could see in your studies you're trying to make, and see that there's more resilience exists in the natural system, in nature as compared to the built systems. And that's what we learned from the history as well, and this must actually continue. And we have encroached upon these areas, and we talk about, and then Lean Against chapter talk about wild beasts in the city. We in the Bhopal also talk about in the previous session with the gentleman pointing out tiger movement within the city, and we are sitting on the corridor of actually the movement of tiger. When we are sitting even right now, so this kind of a connect exists, and we have been forgetting that and trying to, more important to revive this kind of a situation. So your work definitely tries to strengthen this thing, so we can throw more light on this particular chapter and wild beasts in the city and how problems can be handled. You just mentioned about Bangalore, so Sanjay Gandhi National Park in Mumbai, and we have one Vihar National Park here. And similarly, Bannerghatta close to Bangalore city. How they're dealing with the situation, definitely.
So one way to do it is to redefine this. How have societies, states kept environments livable, habitable and productive? How have they done so over long periods, decades or centuries? Delhi is the last place you would name as a place to be looked at in terms of environmental conviviality. It's probably the most or the second most polluted city on the planet in terms of air quality. But another way to look at it, it is a place which 1,000 years of building. There have been 7 cities of Delhi, and one of the issues they dealt with was water. And common to Harini Nagendra's work and Ravi Agarwal's is that in Nagendra's work they're showing that these natural depressions are scooped out and these reservoirs created. In the Delhi case, it's interesting that there's fascinating work by Professor Sunil Kumar which shows a series of check dams in the Aravalis. Now, one of the things about Delhi is it is in a very semi-arid part of the country. About half of India is semi-arid, and Delhi is one of those areas. It rains for 48 hours a year. That's it. But that sweet water from the 14th century till the 2000s, till the coming of the Commonwealth Games incidentally, many of these check dams funnel the water of the Aravali towards the Yamuna, and it is this water in the time of the Sultans which was often important for drinking water. Having said this, we shouldn't romanticize the past. One of the things about the past is it also went through periods of cataclysm and difficulty. But yes, I think in the modern era there is a sharpness of the reason we use the term nature's edge is, are we at the edge of nature? Does nature still exist?
Does it really exist? You are asking a question, or you are giving a reply, or you are
I think one answer to that is to take refuge behind a famous aphorism of Raymond Williams, where he said any notion of nature, any idea of nature is built on a premise of what it means to be human. One of the things we're trying to critique very strongly in this book is the idea that there is a pristine virgin nature. Humans have been part of these systems for millennia, and humans have been very important agents of change. And informing ourselves about those changes can moderate our actions. So we remake environments, we enrich environments, we also destroy environments. We destroy them, we smash them beyond recognition.
So expanding on Madhuji's earlier question, so I would like to ask a very straight question. Does history relate to environmental crisis? Do we learn or do we unlearn from this thing? Because you are a historian also, and you know what is there happening at the global level, also in Delhi, at the Delhi level or Bangalore level, as far as environment, wildlife and things are concerned. Because every now and then we know that the Aravali is also not being spared by the real estate mafia, and my friends have to go to NGT and various other places to secure the Aravalis, the rich movement which Ravi and you all others spot. So the idea is that all the natural, because you said this thing, I have been involved in a wetland conservation for the last 25 years in Indore. And because of that, because of the pressure on that wetland which belonged to the municipal corporation, I started an NGO called the Nature's Volunteer, the Nature Volunteers. And we call it is an informal pressure group of environmentally restless people. We had to talk to large number of municipal commissioners to try and convince them the need to save a wetland. They were not really bothered. So in that situation, is that not an environmental crisis on hand? All over. And then I will come to Yamuna.
Different people look at the same crisis in different ways. One of the very interesting features, since we are asking a question in India, is that I think in the late 60s, there was a considerable environmental awakening. It was not nationwide, everyone did participate. But there was enough participation to bring about new legislation, new executive action. And there was a range of movements.
In the 60s?
The late 60s, early 70s. It's a very, very interesting time. And if you go back and look at, the ban on tiger hunting, the end of sport shikar, the enactment of the Wildlife Protection Act, Mrs. Indira Gandhi giving her very important speech at the UN conference on the human environment in Stockholm. She was the only Prime Minister there other than Olof Palme. That took place at a certain moment. And there was
the same conference where Sundarlal Bahuguna entered with that log of wood on his
He
system.
said poverty is the biggest polluter.
Yeah. 72 Stockholm conference.
No, he was not there.
Okay.
That's probably a later event. But when I said that 50 years ago, there was a series of measures. Now you're in a position to look at the success due to those measures, let's say saving the tiger, slowing down the rate of denudation. You're also in a position to look at the costs that were imposed because of that. Those costs were often disproportionate. But your question, sir, raises a larger one. You know, in the late 1920s, the big debate 100 years ago in the world was about capitalism, communism, and very soon after fascism. It's just about 100 years ago that Mussolini came to power in Italy. Stalin launches a series of changes in the Soviet Union. The US, after the Great Depression, goes in for the New Deal. At that time, in the colonial countries, there was a debate on what kind of future we ought to have. And one of the most famous letters, well known to everybody in this room, even those who haven't read the original letter, was written by one Gujarati to another. The Gujarati who wrote the letter and elicited a reply lived in London. Shapoorji Saklata. He's actually from a very rich Parsi family, but he's a communist member of the House of Commons. Imagine getting into the House of Commons in the 20s and 30s. He's a big fighter against racism. He's a deeply devout socialist Marxist. And he wrote, of course, to the most famous Gujarati ever, Mahatma Gandhi. And Mahatma Gandhi replied to him. Saklatwala argued that the answer to the problems of wealth and poverty would lie in planned development under socialism. And Gandhiji acknowledged these issues. He didn't deny them. But he warned him. He said that if India should adopt the way of England, it will be the tiger without the tiger stripes. And the next line is amazing. He said, if you look at what England has done to the earth, this small set of islands, if 300 million people go down that path, we will strip the earth like a pack of locusts. So at one level, these are epiphenomena. Of course, we should save the Aravallis. We ought to fight to have more water in the Yamuna. We must question, whether or not mining should be done near Panna or in the other parts of the hill ranges. But the larger question is, do we have to rethink our ideas of development? Taking account of the insight in that quotation of Gandhi's. I'm not saying he had all the answers, but that insight. And I think that is the big change of the last 200 years.
Was Gandhiji an early environmentalist, so to say?
I think it would be anachronistic to call him an environmentalist. I'll go with Ram Guha and Govindu, who have worked much more on him than I have, but he had a lot of environmental insight. Certainly the criticism of industrialism. And more than Mahatma Gandhi, some of his disciples, Meera Behan, who founded the Pashulok Ashram in the Kumaon Himalaya, in the 50s was talking of the dangers of pine monoculture, talking about water conservation as being the prime driver of land use in the Himalayas. J.C. Kumarappa, who set up the first biogas plants in India, who talked about renewable, he didn't use the term, talking about biogas and renewable energy in the 1940s. And of course, the later Gandhians, Sundarlalji, Chandi Prasadji, and others. So definitely the Gandhian approach would be a very important part of a modern environmental heritage. It wouldn't be alone, but it would be very important.
A lot of people are drawing parallel between today's Swachhata Abhiyan and what Gandhiji used to tell the countrymen during his time, that to keep the hygiene clean. And he's an early ambassador for cleanliness. Gandhiji was known for all these things.
I don't think he believed in the state driving it. He wanted it driven by the citizen. He wanted citizen action because at one level he believed that the transformation of society has to come from individuals and the community. The other is in his case, and I'm afraid this is not true of Swachhata Abhiyan, he was very interested also in the disposal of human waste. Exactly. Where does it go after you flush that toilet? Presuming there's water there. I think it's very important. He's someone thinking about consequences and responsibility, which perhaps is not always the case with government projects.
So your recovery thing brings me to a very contemporary issue of becoming carbon neutral. We have been in this fashionable term of sustainable development for a very long time. We also pursued that. We have sustainable development goals and all such goals in front of us. And the new term which has come up and we are catching up with the term is becoming carbon neutral. And in fact, Bhutan, our neighboring country which has this gross happiness index, has become carbon negative. So do you think it is a reality or it is reality check bounced? Can we become carbon neutral in reality? And do we learn any lessons from historical experience as well?
This answer has to be given by an economist, I'm not one. But yes, I think if you go back and look at the energy crisis of the 70s, up to 73, we went through a period from 45 to 73 with oil. It's unthinkable today to young people today. We're all young, but those who are younger, is that oil costs $2 a barrel. And this huge surge, this golden era of post-Second World War was because of cheap energy. And even today, a lot of our technologies are founded on that premise that provided you can get it, you can burn it, and it will be fine. But if you look at the 70s, I'm very struck. You look at a country such as France. France around that time did two things. They went in for a very good monorail system and high-speed systems. So you can get to one part of France to the other without resort to a motor car. However, the other thing they did was to really increase their reliance on nuclear energy. So mass transit with nuclear energy. Around the same time, a very remarkable man came to India. He was Mexican. One of the most fascinating figures of the 70s, Ivan Illich. And Ivan Illich traveled across India on foot and bicycle for nearly 2 years. He wrote a very famous book, Energy and Equity, where he argued that the answer to the problems of energy crisis were the bicycle. Now, in the ideal world, he'd want all of us riding bicycles tomorrow. He was a realist, he knew that's not possible. But he said the worst form of energy use is the motor car. And he shows that the motor car is much more inefficient than the public transport bus, and the most efficient would be the mass transit train. So, even if you can't go carbon neutral, you can definitely make rational choices which reduce the intensity of resources. And I'm sure you would agree with me that per capita one can say, oh, you know, the United States per capita is 10 or 15 times that India. But certainly India and China can adopt better routes such as mass transit rather than the private motor.
Mahesh sir, that is rightly said, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, but with your due permission, I would like to open the floor for the audience as well.
Siddharth, just one question. I am taking
Sure,
away
sir.
him from this book.
Please go ahead.
And many of us knew about the Tiger Task Force, which was headed by Sunita Narayan soon after the Sariska debacle, and Prime Minister Manmohan Singh had formed the task force. But there was another task force which was meant for elephants, and it was headed by Mahesh Nagaraj. There was a beautiful report called Gaja, brought out I think in 2012. 10. So I want to know what is the future, how to what extent that report has been implemented. We in Madhya Pradesh, we don't have elephants, so we don't know the world of elephants, but we would like to hear from you about 2 minutes on, and then I'll go back to Guru, and then we'll open the something on elephants and the what is happening in the world of elephants, because you brought out that last year.
The only reason I was made to chair the task force is because I knew very little about elephants. The other 10 people have spent their life working on elephants.
Sir Kumar and others.
And one of the things we confronted, I must say very little happened due to the report. The government is very happy with the report. They patted us on the back. One of them said, hey, this is a gold standard report. You actually all managed to agree on everything you have written. I said, yes. There is one major issue which continues to be very serious. At the time, 100 elephants were being killed every year. And 55-60% were being killed to protect crops. About 400 people then, about 600 now are being killed by elephants.
By elephants.
Now these were normally killed in and around cultivated fields. So we had a big debate. Who's the victim? Is the elephant the victim or the human the victim? And we came to what I think was a fair idea. We said both are victims. The elephants are victims of circumstance. So are those people. And our job is to minimize these conflicts, and where they are unavoidable, to do something serious. We gave a series of suggestions, such as hearings at the start and end of the sowing and the harvesting season, such as securing corridors without land acquisition, because land acquisition leads to other sets of conflicts. Studies, long term, in the 10 worst conflict areas. Very little happened due to the report. They declared the elephant the national heritage animal.
Heritage animal.
The minister then got transferred, and one of the things we had to look at is what about elephant habitat? We had a colleague who will remain nameless, who was very good at coining terms, and he said we'll have 3 kinds of habitat: no go, slow go, and let go. The no go are the areas which are already protected areas. 60% of the elephant reserves are outside the protected areas, unlike the tiger. In those areas, slow go. If you're going to put a road, make sure that it doesn't, most of the roads incidentally are built on old elephant tracks. The elephant was walking the track for hundreds of thousands of years, then you put a road, and you say, hey, why is the elephant walking along my road? Actually the road is on the elephant road. Right. And let go, certain areas which are not. Very little has happened, and I'm afraid that in India today, the idea that GDP must rise at whatever cost is widely held across parties, across people of different political faiths, persuasions, etc. So I regret the problems are still very much there. The elephant still has a lot of friends. Elephants are not as badly off as they could be. They could be much, much better off.
Thank you. So can we have questions from the audience, please?
Anyone
Michael.
who wants to ask any questions can raise their hands. Yes. Gentleman at the back.
महेश, तुमने विदूषक कारखाना का कहा तो मैं हाजिर हूँ एक और दोनों के अलावा। मैं ये पूछ रहा था कि ये जो पूरी बात हमारी हुई है इसमें उस 100 साल के बारे में थोड़ा विस्तार से बात करना चाहिए जो जिसने इन पूरे ताने बाने को तोड़ा है, जो चाहे तो एलिफेंट की बात करें, चाहे टाइगर की बात करें, चाहे जंगल की बात करें या जंगल में रहने वालों की बात करें, तो 100 साल पर कुछ और विस्तार से बात कर सकेंगे क्या? एक बात तो जो आपके अध्ययन में भी है, रोड्स का जो आपने काम किया इतिहास का, उसमें भी मैंने कुछ चीज़ें देखी थी जो बस्तर के या इस इलाकों के बारे में कहा, और फिर वो राज्यों के बनने की प्रक्रिया वो बिल्कुल भिन्न है हमारे राज्यों के बनने की प्रक्रिया से, लेकिन फिर भी पिछला 100 साल जो है वो बहुत बात होता है, तो उस पर कुछ आपको कोई
No, I think that's a valid question. I think that this period from roughly the 1870s or perhaps the end of the Great War has seen huge political changes. But the environmental changes are even more far-reaching. And the changes are not only of technology or of ways in which humans impact nature. It's also that state-making has often boiled down to whose economy grows fastest and for the longest period of time. And if that remains the central driver, then a lot of these other issues, the space actually to deal with them reduces. So I am not suggesting that economies shouldn't grow. I am not saying that at all. The very fine new recent book by Václav Smil, who argues that everybody doesn't need the standard living of the United States. We could get to say Spain, or we could get to France and do it far better. So that I think is a very major question. Related to that is how costs of environmental renewal are shared. Nowadays we are in an era of audiovisual, so I can't resist, I saw a marvelous series recently, and then I found that it was written by a historian. Jeff Ward wrote the script of The Roosevelts. And one of the remarkable things about Franklin Roosevelt is they launched large public parks at the time of the Great Depression. 3 million people worked in the civilian conservation cause. 3 million men, very few women. And they did things which were environmentally critical. At that time, the US was largely a rural society. They planted trees, they did work for soil conservation, water conservation, and that was a very, very major way in which the US renewed its rural economy. So I think that there are ways in which one can have government intervention which addresses issues of livelihood but also restores and renews environments. So I think the 20th century can be looked at in both ways, in terms of unleashing this huge process of economic growth but also leaving it in time.
It's also need to make a connect between different set of stakeholders. You're disconnected with each other, that's why things won't happen the way they're intended to, or all the policies would have good intent but they have, bad outcomes because of this kind of disconnect which is existing.
Yeah, I think there is something very important. I think in the Indian case and in many other countries today, the ideas of the environment may be abstract, but engagement with the environment is very real. So the Citizen Science Initiative, Sohail Kadri, the kind of burst of people we have across small town India, particularly in the southern 4 states, but also in much of northern India, who are timing the arrival and departure dates of the winter migrants. It gives us a much greater engagement with nature. So I think citizen involvement and citizen inquiry and the ability to question that which we think is wrong. So I think there's been a lot of debate about recent citizen action, and to me I think the RE Mill colony protest was very, very significant. This is a relatively better off section of the population taking up an issue not just of the 2,000 or 200 acres that were to be cleared, but of the larger forest area that abuts Bombay. It's critical for the livability of Bombay as a city. So I think absolutely, you think of your environment, but think of it in connection to that wider process. It's not just about my backyard.
So I would like to tell, like the RA forest protest in Bhopal about 4 years ago, the smart city location invited a lot of wrath from the people. And there were actually tree walks led by, including among others, the former Chief Secretary, Mrs. Nirmala Buch. She went away, and we did not do the tree hugging like the Chipko Andolan had seen, but we tried to bring it to the notice of the government that more than 3,000 standing old trees of different species are being felled just because of the smart city location, and no planner had thought about it. The location was shifted, and the new location is giving us new problems. So that is about urbanization and this. But we in Bhopal were able to save more than 3,000 trees just about 3-4 years. So citizen action is also most important.
Sir,
Yes,
I would also
sorry.
like to take one more question
Yeah.
from the lady there.
Last question, sorry.
From the sir or the lady.
And as Mahesh, you've always been part of activism as well. Are you still part of activism? And the issue of the advanced capitalist development, increasing waste, and also transport, increasing the carbon footprint. A little bit about, because there are also lots of movements of reducing waste and a different development paradigm. So if there's anything at the national level or in different states about activism regarding these, and it also often reminds me of the totally, we post-positivistic science, we look at nature as a resource, whereas traditional societies, humans looked at themselves as part of nature. An example of this is that we call Abuj Mar in Bastar, as if people don't know, Abuj is not knowing, whereas the tribals there call that whole area Shringar Bhoom. This was brought to my notice by Sabyasachi. So this integration of tribal life and less use and repeated use versus to keep capitalism going, throwaway kind of use, packaged stuff, we are all part of that Amazon and other culture. So is there a growing movement to resist that, and where could one connect to those larger movements?
Many of what you would refer to as advanced capitalist countries, say Japan, US or the European countries, had precisely that throwaway culture because of considerable citizen action. Not only technology, because of regulation, community empowerment, people's participation, much greater consciousness. That throwaway culture has, to a large extent, been brought under control. I'll give you a very strange instance. In the 60s, 70s, there was a lot of worry about the decline of birds of prey. Rachel Carson wrote about the bald eagle. In the 70s, there was concern about Shaheen falcon, which I think there they call the peregrine falcon. So all of you would have seen films of Denzel Washington and Angelina Jolie. So there's a film, I don't know if you recall it, The Bone Collector. Remarkable. Denzel Washington is on his back in the whole film, he can only speak. And he solves a crime lying on his bed, of course. But in one of the scenes, they show a peregrine falcon flying off the window. The peregrine falcons come back to the skies of the United States because pesticide levels have gone down. I'm afraid India, China, Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia, Vietnam, precisely at the time when the West moved out of that, we moved in. There's a frightening book whose name I'm forgetting. It's a frightening book by Robin Jeffrey and Asa Doron. It's an Australian-Israeli on India. And I forget the figure. The amount of waste produced by urban Indian has gone up some 80-fold in the last 20 years. 80-fold. So this mountain of garbage, I think it's an excellent example. So when we look at advanced capitalist society, we can also pick up some of the positive elements that are there in it, such as a state which has the capacity to regulate and citizens who also have a level of consciousness. Your other point is extremely well taken. I think this is absolutely critical. One of the most remarkable books recently written was Carbon Democracy, in which Mitchell argues that the coming of oil is the big change. Oil is very fluid, and it has brought about a level of not just waste but of exploitation, both of nature and labor, which is huge. So I think that's a very valid point, and it, again, please look carefully, precisely the things, and leave the United States out for a minute, which many of the advanced developed world has done. Particularly look at the Scandinavian countries, them as now often regarded as exemplars. Now we can't do all of the things they're doing, I'm not suggesting that. There's no model, you can't pick up something from A and fit it to B. But definitely, looking at cultures of prudence would be absolutely vital. The instance which Sabyasachi brings out beautifully in another essay, which I'm sure you know very well, The Tiger and the Honeybee, where he shows that in Simlipal, the Mayurbhanj, hill kharyas measure the productivity of the forest in terms of honey, the madhu bhandars, the taste of honey in the forest, the pollinator, whereas the forest department keeps counting the tigers, whether they do it right or wrong, I don't know. And they look at the predator. And here in the forest departments, the tiger and people are separate. Whereas in the hill kharya view, they are among the people who are the guardians of the madhu bhandar. So of course we have to respectfully learn from such cultures, but that may have to be combined with an understanding of these new technologies and approaches.
Thank you for watching the session from BLF 2020. Kindly subscribe to our channel for more such videos.